Hey everyone, Mr. Jeffersonian here, and if you haven't heard about Anchor, let me explain. It's the easiest way to make a podcast. First off, it's free, and who doesn't like that? There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer, and Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So the call to action is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Howdy everyone, and thank you again for tuning in to the Jeffersonian Tradition. Before we get started, I have a couple of things to go over. For now, the podcast is mostly ad-free, and I sure would like to keep it that way. You can help me out with that by becoming a supporting listener. If you find value in the podcast, there is a link in the show notes page that will enable you to contribute to my work and to help keep the podcast going, and also help to keep the show light on advertising. Contributions start as low as 99 cents per month, with two other brackets at $4.99 per month or $9.99 per month. If you're not comfortable with a recurring contribution model, I've also set up a Cash App profile for the show. One-time contributions can be sent through Cash App to the show's profile, and that information is included in the show notes page. Any contribution amounts help, and thank you in advance to anyone who chooses to pitch in. In other show-related news, if there is a topic you'd like for me to cover, or if you just have general questions for me, I can be contacted at the show email address, which again is mrjeffersonian@outlook.com, or you can reach me through our growing MeWe group titled after the show. So if you'd like to be a member there, then download the MeWe app and search for me at the username Mr. Jeffersonian. It is a private group, so we must be contacts before I can send you the group invite. If you aren't familiar with MeWe, contacts are the same as being friends on Facebook. With all of that fun stuff out of the way, let's now turn our attention to the topic for today's episode, which is why I no longer consider myself a libertarian. So just a little context before I go into the reasons that caused me to abandon libertarianism. I'm going to describe what kind of libertarian I was. So before I start, I do want to start off by saying that in the arena of ideas, libertarianism stands alone as the most consistent political philosophy, and if we lived in a purely abstract world, there would be no contest, and it would be the undisputed champion. Now, inspired by voices such as Tom Woods, Dave Smith, Murray Rothbard, and to a lesser extent Chase Rachels, I was mostly in line with the anarchocapitalist worldview. For me, the goal was freedom, regardless of how it was achieved. So this meant that even if the Supreme Court took on a case it didn't have jurisdiction over, I didn't necessarily care so long as they ruled correctly, or in other words, as long as they ruled pro-liberty. Little did I realize at the time that I was actually sowing the seeds of my own destruction, as trusting a federal court to consistently curtail federal power undermines the entire argument of a conservative or even a libertarian position. Now, ANCAPs also believe that the individual is the expression of ultimate political rights and that the individual should be protected above everything else because the individual is the smallest minority. And so that means they're also, by extension, the most vulnerable minority. So property rights are also paramount to the belief system of ANCAPs, with private property owners having near total final say in the goings-on of said property, as long as no crime is committed, and specifically crimes that have victims. So, for example, if a property owner wants to have a meth lab on their property, fine, just don't go out and try to force anybody to do meth. And I use this example because most ANCAPs are for the full decriminalization of drugs, although there is vigorous debate surrounding how this would function in the model version of Ancapistan, which is an ANCAP's version of utopia. Now, ANCAPs also envision a world where the total state apparatus is abolished. So that means all levels of government, general government, state government, city government, so on and so forth. Now, They do envision a world without rulers, but that is definitely not to say that they envision a world without rules. So the Hoppian stream of this variety think that we should or would see covenant communities spring up to act as extremely small and hyperlocal governments, with private mediators serving as a judicial system. And then policing would work on some sort of subscription model in most people's thoughts. And the police forces would be contracted either by insurance companies or by the covenant communities directly. And I still think from a conceptual standpoint and an idealistic standpoint, these are incredibly worthy goals to pursue. And if libertarians could ever start winning the war of ideas en masse, I will freely admit that I still would love to see the Overton window continue to shift in the anarchist direction. So now that we have an understanding of where I came from on my political journey, as well as what an anarcho-capitalist is, I'm going to get into the issues that actually drove me away from it. And so about 4 years ago, Tom had Brian McClanahan on his show as a guest. Brian McClanahan is a fantastic historian. And in this particular episode, I believe they discuss certain aspects of the War for Southern Independence. I was raised with a certain level of awe regarding the Confederacy, so I've always been a sucker for any conversation regarding the topic. And from this initial exposure to Brian, I began listening to his podcast, which is the Brian McClanahan Show, and I started listening to it every day, and I began to understand more deeply the beautiful intricacies of federalism and decentralization. So Brian was and continues to be my gateway to the Jeffersonian tradition. Now, this alone was not enough to change my overall worldview, so as great as Brian was, I still at that point was not ready to abandon Anarchocapistan. There have been a few developments in the libertarian world that eventually caused me to become disillusioned. So, first and foremost, libertarians are their own worst enemy, and trying to get them to unite on anything besides legal weed can be worse than herding cats. And this issue alone ensures that the Libertarian Party proper stays irrelevant in almost all electoral politics, and some of that has been remedied recently with the massive amount of work by folks like Michael Heiss and others in the Mises caucus of the Libertarian Party. But by and large, it's going to stay irrelevant because libertarians, by and large, they can't agree on anything. I mean, if you get a group of 10 libertarians in the same room, you're going to have blood feuds for life amongst 10 different people. So that's one thing that, at least as an organized effort, it kind of made me lose hope, at least for now. The next major issue is that many libertarians have failed to recognize the failure of embracing the incorporation doctrine. The short definition of incorporation doctrine is that the federal judiciary can overturn state law via judicial review, claiming that the general constitution incorporates or covers the individual states. Libertarian embrace of selective legal incorporation was the first wedge that developed in my mind when I started studying the Jeffersonian path in depth, because incorporation has given us such dreadful decisions as McDonald v. Chicago, D.C. v. Heller, Cohens v. Virginia, Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch v. Maryland, Texas v. White, and a host of others. This was not the intent of the founders, at least the anti-federalist, as they greatly feared the evil that would arise from a politically motivated federal court system. And so with libertarians being willing to embrace that, the real issue comes about when they cheer on the federal court system when it's something that they like. And I used to be guilty of this, just full transparency. They cheer on a court decision that they like without really stopping to think about the long-term implications. And so recently there was a California decision or law, state law, that was overturned by a federal judge, which said that California had no right to strip its citizens of the right to own quote-unquote assault weapons. And libertarians cheered this, many of them blindly so. And never mind the fact that D.C. versus Heller, although it was a pro-gun decision, the majority opinion on that actually said that firearms would continue to be regulated and that the Second Amendment was not absolute. So we actually have to stop and contextualize this stuff and say, wait a minute, is this actually a good thing? So even though people in California may not be able to purchase assault weapons, hey, leave California. So that was the first wedge. Just the fact that they would never, or a lot of them would never stop and question, is this actually a good thing over the course of time? Now, third, there are still libertarians out there who, even after witnessing the disaster that was 2020, cling to the argument of private companies can do whatever they want, no matter how socially damaging these choices may be. And their thing is you can just choose not to shop there, or you can just make your own store, so on and so forth. Very tired arguments, in my opinion, because in the real world, it's not that easy. Not everybody's going to have, a chunk of change to go and start a general store that can become the next Walmart. That's just not realistic thoughts in the modern times. And so that really bothers me. Now, I'm torn on the subject of corporations, as some of them do bring incredible value to my own life, but at the same time, every single time there's an economic disruption, the corporations consolidate further, and small businesses, along with taxpayers, are left with the bill when the bailouts inevitably come. And this is where libertarians are going to screech when they hear this, because they're going to say, well, that's not real capitalism. Okay, granted, fine, you're right. As soon as there's any sort of governmental interference, yes, you're right. But we say the same thing about socialism. Now, I believe socialism to be a bad idea, but that's the rebuttal that we get from the socialist. Oh, that's not real socialism. Real socialism has never been tried. Well, with this, that's not real capitalism. We haven't had that since the, early 1800s. So that is another thing that's really gotten to me. You're not going to win many friends with that by just sitting there saying, well, private companies can do whatever they want. You're not going to win many friends with that. I actually think that should be left up to the state, specifically the individual states, not the general government state. But you could have California say, if you want to do business in California, you have to serve any and all customers, regardless of political or religious beliefs. And then you could have a state like Texas say, nope, here in Texas, you are free to discriminate on whatever basis you see fit, and you are the property owner, so you have final say on everything. We could see competition, right? So that would be a good thing. So this is something, again, I fell off the bandwagon because they want to try to force liberty from the top down. Not every body politic is going to want that. And who are we to tell one state that they have to do things a certain way if a majority, and in some cases an overwhelming majority, of people in the state want to do things a different way? Now, my philosophy has evolved dramatically on this particular subject, as I now think fracturing concentrated power should be the goal of politics in general. Aside from this, many libertarians also tend to spend so much time in the abstract dream world of Anarchocapistan that they tune out to what's really going on around them. And many still refuse to vote because it either legitimizes the system in their opinion, or because they don't believe in governmental authority to begin with. So why vote against that local tax? Because I don't believe in it. And I use this to show you the literal thought processes one may encounter from time to time in these types of libertarian spheres. Ultimately, it does not matter what you believe in. You will have to pay the tax. And libertarians, by and large, won't even go out and vote defensively. So to an extent, you deserve what you get. And that, it blows my mind. If you have a chance to go out, especially for local taxes, if you have a chance to go out and vote against it, and you choose not to based on some misunderstanding of Lysander Spooner, then you deserve what you get. Get out there and vote. Even if it's in a defensive nature, Spooner himself defended that. He was very much so a proponent of defensive voting. Now, the last issue that I'll touch on as far as what drove me away from the party is the infighting. There was a dumpster fire that recently took place in the New Hampshire State Party. I'll touch lightly on that. Essentially, you had a duly elected board for the New Hampshire State Libertarian affiliate. The National Party decided that was not going to fly, and they removed them and installed a puppet one. It ultimately culminated with the rightfully elected board being implemented, and everybody else on the national side just kind of resigned from the party over this. But it was an atrocity in every sense of the word. Now, on a positive note, maybe this means that the Mises Caucus will actually be able to finally really take over, but at the same time, it was just not very good optics. Now, there have also recently been some attacks on Dave Smith, and that really drove the point home for me that the party proper in its current state is a self-defeating tub of hot dog water. But if the Mises Caucus is successful in rebranding the party, then I do think it would have some great long-term viability if it can get more exposure. And I think there could be a strong fusion ticket for Mecock libertarians and Jeffersonians because for all of our differences, there is a lot of overlap. And this brings me to my next point, which is then why Jeffersonianism? Like if you got so disaffected with libertarianism, why Jeffersonianism? Well, as mentioned, Brian McClanahan was a huge influence on my early perception of the Jeffersonian tradition, and he really kind of helped transfigure my envisionment of the role of state and local governments. The main problem with our current situation, at least as I see it, isn't so much that government exists, it's the sheer concentration of power, especially the consolidation of the central or general government. And the more power that goes to that government, the worse it's going to be because you're going to have, it's people using the central government to force their worldview on everybody else. So if the Democrats get in charge, they're forcing their worldview on Republicans, and then vice versa. If Republicans get in charge, they're using it to force their lifestyle on the Democrats, or trying to. So the states individually have the infrastructure in place to fight back against that, and they can be incredibly potent vehicles of resistance. And as going back at least as far as the Suffolk resolves, they have a strong history of nullification at the individual state level, and we've already done an episode on nullification. So I believe that it takes power to check power, and the states individually offer a path to at least organize some type of resistance versus an extremely, extremely loose coalition of individuals who cannot be herded. Now, should nullification prove an ineffective check on the power of the central government, then secession remains as the final outlet of a state to look out for the interest of its own citizenry. And recently, we're seeing peaceful secession movements. Think Brexit. Secession does not have to equal violence or war. It really can happen peacefully. And so that's another reason I've embraced the Jeffersonian method, where you just focus on your local level up to the state and take over from there. And I think something actually like the Free State Project that's going on in New Hampshire is a great idea. I think they picked the wrong state because there were less populous states out there. But I do think that's an extremely, extremely effective method to start taking over state by state and roll back some of this stuff by using the existing state government. Wonderful, wonderful option there. Returning power to the states would also give us real competition in governmental policies. If Florida wants to roll back regulation and lower taxes and let the market determine most facets of day-to-day life, they could absolutely do so. If California or Vermont want to go full-on socialist, they could do so. It's not up to us to bail them out and save them from themselves with these bad decisions. Now, if they implemented some of these policies and they worked, well, there you go. That's a real-world refutation of libertarian ideology. But if Florida or any other state who wants to take a more libertarian approach ends up being the beacon on a hill, then that's a refutation of the other policy. And we could see that play itself out in real time. We can look now. California is going to be losing a seat in the House of Representatives because people are tired of dealing with their taxes, their overburdensome regulatory system, and everything else. So we could actually see that play itself out even more so in real time, and we could see states rise and fall accordingly. Now, I also believe that politics is downstream of culture, and that wasn't always the case for me. I kind of thought that government really had a pretty large influence on how culture developed, but now it's changed, and I think that government is actually more downstream of culture. So with that being said, I think state governments are at least somewhat reflective of their constituents. And along these same lines, I've come to think that culture is something very much worth saving and preserving, and the current regime is doing everything it can to destroy the traditional American culture of individualism and self-sufficiency. States can help reverse this trend by finding their spines and stop their feeding at the federal trough. Now, again, there are going to be some states that may unfortunately be too far gone. California, I think, is probably one of them. But for the states that are still decent, we have to return power to them and empower them to retain and protect the local culture and not give in to the siren song of the center of, hey, take all this federal cash, but with the king's money comes the king's strings. And overall, I think this concept is just more palatable to people that I have personally interacted with. Now, maybe I just haven't found the magic sauce for trying to pitch the ANCAP version of libertarianism, but people usually shut down, or they'll say that it's a good idea, but it can never work in the real world whenever I've talked about anarchocapitalism with them. And generally, the first pushback that I get is along the lines of, well, you're just going to have a bunch of warlords. And my response to that would be, well, you don't think that the U.S., being the empire that it is, already has a series of warlords? And that does make them think, but ultimately, I just don't think that most people are ready for that level of decentralization yet, in terms of going all the way down to the individual and having practical anarchy. All right, so we're going to go ahead and stop here for today. The main takeaway from today's episode is that libertarians say liberty at all cost, with an eventual abolition of the state apparatus. Jeffersonianism wants decentralization as its end goal, with the concept of political self-determination as the greatest political attainment. Please remember, if you find value in the podcast, to consider contributing to the show. You can contribute on a recurring basis through the supporting listener link attached in the show notes page, or you can make a one-time contribution by using the show's Cash App information, which is also included in the show notes page. Any contribution amount helps, and thank you again to everyone in advance who decides to do so. And all right, with another episode in the books, thank you again for tuning in to the Jeffersonian Tradition, and I'll talk to y'all next time.